How did ancient empires sprawling across thousands of miles, with no phones, no highways, and no internet, stay connected? It's a question that seems almost impossible to answer when you think about the sheer scale of civilizations like Rome, Persia, or the Mongol Empire. These weren't just kingdoms, they were colossal networks of power, trade, and culture stretching across continents, and yet they didn't collapse under their own weight. Instead, they flourished thanks to a web of secret systems hidden in plain sight. These were the lifelines that kept empires alive, the invisible threads tying distant cities, armies, and markets together. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on these forgotten marvels. Picture this: a messenger sprinting across rugged mountains, a trader navigating uncharted deserts, or a coded message etched into a piece of pottery, all part of a grand, silent symphony of communication and control. These weren't just random acts, they were carefully orchestrated moves in a game of survival and dominance. The Romans built roads that doubled as information highways. The Persians perfected a relay system so fast it could deliver news faster than a galloping horse. And the Mongols, they turned the vast, open steppes into a network of way stations, allowing them to rule the largest land empire in history. These weren't just feats of engineering, they were strokes of genius, the kind that reshaped the world. But here's the real mystery: why don't we talk about these systems more? We marvel at ancient monuments and battles, but the true backbone of these empires, the networks that made them possible, often gets overlooked. That's what makes this story so thrilling. Because when you start to piece together how these systems worked, you realize something extraordinary. The ancient world was far more connected, far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. And the echoes of these networks, they're still with us today, hidden in the way our modern world operates. So let's journey back through time, across deserts and mountains, into the heart of empires long gone, to uncover the secret networks that kept them alive. What you're about to discover might just change how you see history forever. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for luxury goods, it was the ancient world's internet, a bustling highway of ideas, influence, and intrigue. Think of those caravans winding through deserts and mountains. While silk and spices filled their saddlebags, something far more valuable traveled with them: knowledge. A single merchant could carry groundbreaking innovations, like paper-making from China or glass-blowing techniques from Persia, spreading them further than any army or emperor ever could. But these exchanges weren't just about commerce. Behind the scenes, this network pulsed with political maneuvering. Rest stops, known as caravanserais, weren't just places to sleep. They were hotspots for whispered alliances and covert intelligence. A trader from Samarkand might overhear rumors of a distant rebellion, then pass that information to a diplomat at the next oasis. What made the Silk Road revolutionary wasn't just its scale, it was its adaptability. Unlike rigid imperial roads, this network thrived precisely because it was decentralized. No single power controlled it entirely, yet empires like Tang China or Byzantium leveraged it masterfully. They didn't need to conquer every mile, they just needed to influence the right nodes along the route. Take the Sogdians, the unsung middlemen of Central Asia. Fluent in multiple languages and cultures, they didn't just move goods, they brokered trust between empires that often distrusted each other. Their role was so vital that when the Sogdian network weakened, entire sections of the Silk Road faltered. And then there were the unintended consequences. Those same caravans that carried silks and philosophies also transported something invisible yet devastating: disease. The spread of the Justinian plague along these routes reshaped empires more decisively than any war. It's a stark reminder that connectivity came at a cost. Yet even then, the network endured, because for all its risks, the Silk Road offered something irreplaceable, a way for civilizations to grow not just richer, but smarter, more resilient, more intertwined. The echoes of that system are still with us today, in everything from global trade routes to the way information spreads across borders. The Silk Road didn't just connect places, it connected futures. The Roman roads were far more than just pathways of stone. They were the ultimate power move in ancient engineering. Imagine a network so meticulously planned that it could move an entire legion from Rome to the distant frontiers of Britain in just weeks. That speed was revolutionary. While other empires relied on unpredictable rivers or rough trails, Rome engineered highways with purpose-built foundations, layers of crushed stone, compacted gravel, and finishing slabs fitted together like a puzzle. These weren't just durable, they were designed for all-weather travel. Rain or shine, Rome's armies, tax collectors, and couriers kept moving, and that reliability was the empire's secret weapon. But the real genius wasn't just in the construction, it was in the details. Every mile was marked with stone pillars, acting as ancient signposts that told travelers exactly how far they were from Rome. Think of them like the first highway exit signs, creating a sense of order in a vast world. Then there were the way stations, spaced a day's journey apart, where imperial messengers could swap tired horses for fresh ones. This relay system meant urgent news could race across the empire at nearly 200 miles a day. A message from the Rhine frontier could reach the emperor faster than a ship could cross the Mediterranean. And here's what's truly astonishing. These roads weren't just functional, they were transformative. Wherever they stretched, Roman culture followed. Latin graffiti carved into milestone markers. Inns and markets springing up at crossroads. Even local languages began borrowing Latin words for things like wine and money. The roads didn't just move soldiers, they moved ideas, turning distant provinces into mirrors of Rome itself. Yet the most enduring legacy might be how these roads outlasted the empire that built them. Medieval pilgrims followed them to holy sites. Renaissance scholars traced their paths to rediscover ancient texts. Today, modern highways in Europe often run atop the same routes, a silent tribute to Roman foresight. Those stones weren't just laid for conquest, they were laid for eternity. The Persian royal road didn't just move messages, it moved empires. Imagine a highway so precisely engineered that a royal decree could leap from Susa to Sardis, over 1,500 miles of rugged terrain in just 7 days. That's faster than a galloping horse could manage on its own, and the secret lay in Darius the Great's masterstroke, a relay system of way stations, each stocked with fresh mounts and trained riders. A courier would race to the next post, hand off his scroll to a waiting messenger, and like a baton in a sprint, the information never slowed down. This wasn't just mail delivery, it was ancient logistics perfected. But speed was only half the story. The royal road was also a tool of control, woven with layers of secrecy. Rebellions often flared at the edges of Persia's vast territories, but news of unrest could reach the capital before local leaders even finished plotting. Darius didn't just outpace his enemies, he outthought them. By the time rebels mobilized, Persian armies were already on the march thanks to those tireless riders. And it wasn't just the military that benefited. Tax collectors, provincial governors, even spies relied on this network, turning scattered satrapies into a tightly managed empire. What's fascinating is how modern this system felt. The royal road functioned like an early version of encrypted communication. Messengers carried sealed scrolls, and only trusted officials at key hubs could decode them. Some historians compare it to a secure server network where sensitive data moved swiftly but selectively. Even the Greeks, who often clashed with Persia, grudgingly admired its efficiency. Herodotus himself marveled at how neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night could stop these couriers, a phrase so iconic it later became the unofficial motto of the U.S. Postal Service. Yet the real legacy of the Royal Road lies in its influence. Centuries later, the Mongol Yam adapted its relay concept to span an even larger empire. The Pony Express, though short-lived, echoed its urgency. And today, when we track a package crossing continents in days or send an email across oceans in seconds, we're tapping into that same ancient hunger for connection. Darius didn't just build a road, he built an idea. That distance should never dictate destiny. High in the thin air of the Andes, where even breathing could feel like a struggle, the Inca engineered a communication system so efficient it defied the mountains themselves. The Chasqui runners weren't just messengers, they were elite athletes, trained from childhood to sprint at dizzying altitudes, each one a vital link in a living, breathing network. Picture them, young men poised in stone-built tambos, perched along winding mountain paths, ready to burst into action at a moment's notice. When a runner approached, his successor would hear the blast of a conch shell echoing through the valleys, then dash forward to meet him, never breaking stride as the message transferred seamlessly. This wasn't just a relay. It was a perfectly timed dance of endurance and precision, capable of shuttling news from Cusco to the empire's farthest corners faster than a galloping horse could on flat ground. But the real marvel wasn't just the speed, it was how they carried knowledge without a single written word. The Quipu, a bundle of intricately knotted cords, was their secret. At first glance, these colorful strings might look like simple decorations, but each knot's position, size, and even the type of twist held layers of meaning. Census data, troop movements, even historical records, all encoded in a language of loops and hitches. Some researchers believe Quipus could track everything from grain stores in distant warehouses to the movements of the stars. Imagine a spreadsheet woven in wool capable of crossing linguistic barriers. When a chasqui arrived at a tambo, he didn't just deliver a message, he delivered an entire database decipherable by trained interpreters across the empire. What's astonishing is how this system mirrored the Inca worldview. Just as their terraced farms transformed steep slopes into fertile fields, their communication network turned the Andes' brutal geography into an advantage. While other empires relied on flat roads, the Inca used verticality itself as a tool. Messengers traveled trails so narrow that only foot traffic could pass, making their network nearly impervious to invasion. And because tambos doubled as storage depots, they kept runners fueled with freeze-dried potatoes and chicha beer, an ancient version of energy gels and sports drinks. Yet the true testament to their genius lies in what happened when outsiders tried to replicate it. Spanish conquistadors, armed with horses and written decrees, were baffled by the Quipu's efficiency. One chronicler wrote that Inca administrators could recall decades-old tax records from memory, guided by the knots. Even today, scholars are still unraveling the full scope of what these cords might have held. The system was so effective that the Spanish eventually co-opted it, using Quipus to track their own colonial plunder. In a world obsessed with alphabets and ink, the Inca proved that information doesn't need letters to travel, it needs ingenuity. Their network wasn't just a tool of empire, it was a rebellion against limits, a reminder that even the most unforgiving landscapes can be mastered with creativity. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of the Chasquis. Sometimes the most powerful messages aren't written, they are carried hand to hand across the roof of the world. The Mediterranean wasn't just a body of water to the Phoenicians, It was a sprawling, liquid highway pulsing with opportunity. While other empires carved their names into stone, these seafaring pioneers carved theirs into the tides, building a network so vast it stretched from the rocky shores of Lebanon to the misty coasts of Britain. Their ships, sleek and nimble, sliced through waves with cargo holds full of treasures. Tyrian purple, dye so rare it was worth its weight in silver, blown glass that caught the sunlight like liquid gemstones, and cedar wood prized by kings from Babylon to Egypt. But the most revolutionary thing they carried wasn't a luxury good, it was an idea. The Phoenician alphabet, a simple set of symbols that could capture any spoken word, would become the blueprint for nearly every writing system in the Western world. What set the Phoenicians apart wasn't just their goods or their ships, it was their strategy. Unlike land empires that conquered through brute force, they thrived through connection. Colonies like Carthage, Gadea, and Byblos weren't just trading posts. They were cultural crossroads where Phoenician merchants blended local traditions with their own. A sailor in Sicily might worship Baal Hammon under an Italian sky, while a craftsman in Iberia fused Phoenician glass techniques with Celtic designs. This wasn't an empire held together by armies, but by shared language, mutual profit, and a web of trust spun across thousands of miles, and their naval technology. Unmatched, while others hugged the coastline, terrified of open water, Phoenician captains navigated by the stars, reading the night sky like a map. They even used the North Star, which they called the Phoenician Star, as their celestial guide. Their ships, built from Lebanon's legendary cedars, were engineered for both speed and capacity, with hulls reinforced for rough seas and sails that could catch the slightest breeze. When King Solomon needed a fleet to bring back gold from Ophir, he didn't train his own sailors, he hired Phoenicians. But perhaps their greatest legacy was how they turned isolation into advantage. Nestled between mountains and sea with little farmland, they didn't just adapt to trade, they redefined it. Their decentralized network meant that even if one city fell, the others thrived. When Assyria crushed Tyre, Carthage rose. When Persia absorbed Sidon, their merchants still dominated Mediterranean markets. They proved something radical. You didn't need a standing army to wield influence, you needed a good harbor and a sharper mind. Centuries later, their innovations would echo in Venetian trade routes, Dutch merchant fleets, even British naval dominance. The Phoenicians didn't just sail the Mediterranean, they tamed it, showing the world that the future belonged to those who could master the sea. And in doing so, they quietly shaped the course of history, one voyage at a time. The Mongol Yam wasn't just a mail service, it was the ultimate weapon of speed and control. Imagine a lone rider thundering across the endless steppe, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he races toward a distant horizon, but he isn't alone. Every 20 miles, a fresh horse and a new rider stand ready, waiting for the baton to pass without missing a beat. This wasn't just efficiency, it was a revolution in communication, allowing Genghis Khan's commands to outpace rebellion, rumor, even the changing seasons. While European kings waited weeks for news from their borders, the Mongols could dispatch orders from Karakorum to Hungary in days, stitching together an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. What made the Yam so devastatingly effective wasn't just the horses, it was the infrastructure. Way stations called Yam dotted the landscape like medieval pit stops, each one stocked with food, spare mounts, and even replacement riders in case of exhaustion. These weren't slapped together, they were carefully placed along routes calculated for maximum speed, often following ancient trade paths or river valleys. And here's the twist, the system wasn't just for the Mongols. Merchants, diplomats, even foreign spies could use it for a price. The Yam became a tool of soft power, binding conquered territories to the empire not just through fear, but through convenience. Need to send a message across 3,000 miles. The Yam could do it faster than anyone thought possible, but speed was only part of the equation. The Yam also functioned as an early surveillance state. Station masters kept meticulous records of who passed through, what they carried, even the tone of their conversations. If a rider reported unrest in a distant province, the Khan could dispatch troops before the rebels finished sharpening their swords. This wasn't just communication, it was omniscience, the ability to see and react to events as if the empire were a single living organism. And the system had a dark genius. It was self-sustaining. Local communities were required to maintain the stations, providing horses and supplies as part of their tribute. In exchange, they gained access to the fastest information network on Earth. It was a brutal bargain, but one that kept the empire humming. Even Marco Polo, no stranger to marvels, wrote in awe of the Yam's precision, describing how riders could cover 10 days' journey in just 2. Yet the Yam's greatest legacy might be how it reshaped warfare itself. Before the Mongols, armies moved at the speed of their slowest supply carts. But with the Yam, generals could coordinate attacks across continents, converging on enemies like wolves encircling prey. When Subutai planned his invasion of Europe, he didn't just rely on tactics, he relied on real-time intelligence, fed to him by riders who'd scouted every mile ahead. The result, battlefields where the Mongols seemed to be everywhere at once. What's astonishing is how modern the Yam feels today. Replace horses with fiber optic cables, and you've got something eerily similar to our digital networks, a system where information moves faster than physical limits should allow. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they conquered time itself, compressing the vastness of their empire into something manageable, responsive, alive. And when the empire finally crumbled, it wasn't the Yam that failed, it was the world that couldn't keep up. Every empire had its armies, its merchants, its roads, but behind the curtain of history moved another kind of force entirely, the spies. These weren't just shadowy figures lurking in alleyways, they were the invisible architects of imperial survival. Take Rome's frumentarii, for instance. On paper, they were humble grain collectors, traveling the provinces to oversee wheat shipments, but their real job, gathering whispers, a tavern brawl in Gaul, a disgruntled governor's rant in Syria, even the mood of the crowds before a gladiator match, all of it flowed back to Rome through these unassuming agents. They were the empire's early warning system, turning gossip into actionable intelligence long before threats could erupt. Persia took this game of shadows to another level. Their network of informants, known as the eyes and ears of the king, operated with chilling efficiency. Unlike Rome's frumentarii, who blended in, Persia's spies often held visible positions, tax officials, diplomats, even royal tutors. This wasn't just about stealth, it was about psychological control. When a satrap knew his own staff might be reporting on him, rebellion became far riskier. Herodotus recounts how one Persian ruler uncovered a plot simply because a nobleman's concubine, secretly an informant, overheard drunken boasts. The lesson was clear: trust no one because the king's reach was everywhere. But espionage wasn't just about suppressing dissent. It was a tool of economic warfare. Han China's secret envoys infiltrated the nomadic Xiongnu tribes, not just to map their movements, but to learn which goods they coveted most. Silk, it turned out, was more than a luxury, it was a weapon. By controlling its flow, the Han could manipulate tribal alliances, turning fierce warriors into dependent clients. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, spies disguised as merchants smuggled silkworms out of China, breaking a centuries-old monopoly and flooding the market with cheaper silk. The result, a financial windfall that bankrolled Constantinople's golden age. What's striking is how little these systems relied on technology. No satellites, no wiretaps, just human cunning and meticulous organization. The Mongols, for example, employed scouts who could read the steppe like a book, disturbed grass revealing an army's path, bird flight signaling nearby water sources. Their reports let generals like Subutai orchestrate battles with terrifying precision, ambushing enemies who never saw them coming. Yet the true power of these networks lay in their ambiguity. A spy's greatest asset wasn't just the secrets they stole, but the fear they sowed. When no one knew who might be watching, obedience became the safest choice. That's why empires invested so heavily in these invisible threads, because while roads moved armies and markets moved goods, spies moved the one thing that truly ruled the ancient world: perception. And in that, they were centuries ahead of their time. Pilgrimage routes were the ancient world's social media, connecting people, ideas, and wealth across continents under the banner of faith. Imagine the Hajj caravan winding through the deserts of Arabia, a river of travelers from Mali to Malaysia, each carrying more than just prayer mats. In their saddlebags were medicinal herbs from India, legal treatises from Persia, even new farming techniques from the Nile Delta. Mecca wasn't just a destination. It was a colossal exchange where scholars debated under the same tents that sheltered blacksmiths and spice merchants. The Kaaba became more than a shrine. It was a living library of human connection. But the real power of these pilgrimages lay in their ability to transcend politics. Jerusalem, contested by empires for centuries, saw crusaders and Muslim scholars trading knowledge in its markets despite their wars. A Byzantine monk might share an ancient Greek text with a Baghdad mathematician who'd later refine algebra using those very concepts. Varanasi's Ghats, where Hindu pilgrims bathed in the Ganges, doubled as informal courts where disputes between distant kingdoms were settled by priestly mediators. Faith created neutral ground where even bitter rivals could negotiate, because no one wanted divine wrath alongside earthly conflict. Temples and mosques functioned as early multinational corporations. The Knights Templar, originally protectors of pilgrims, evolved into Europe's first bankers by safeguarding gold deposits across their network of chapels, issuing letters of credit redeemable from Paris to Jerusalem. In Japan, Shinto shrines like Ai's Jingu stored rice tributes that could feed armies or relieve famines, acting as state treasuries with divine authority. And let's not forget the Buddhist monasteries along the Silk Road, where monks preserved not just scriptures but entire languages, sheltering Sanskrit texts from wars that erased kingdoms. What's fascinating is how these routes shaped culture itself. The Camino de Santiago, threading through medieval Europe, became a conveyor belt for architectural styles. A stonemason from Burgos might learn new techniques from a French pilgrim, then blend them with Moorish designs he'd seen in Andalusia. The result, cathedrals that were living passports of artistry. Even fashion traveled these paths, Persian weaving patterns showing up in English tapestries, or African indigo dyes coloring robes in Tibetan monasteries. Yet the most enduring legacy might be how these networks outlasted the empires that tried to control them. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad, the Hajj continued. When Rome fell, pilgrims still trekked to Jerusalem, because faith, unlike borders, couldn't be erased by edicts or invasions. These routes remind us that some connections run deeper than treaties or trade. They're etched into the human spirit, invisible threads weaving civilizations together long after armies turned to dust. In the blistering heart of the desert, where the sun could scorch the earth into cracked oblivion, Persia's survival hinged on a secret buried beneath the sand, the Canat. These weren't just tunnels, they were masterpieces of hydraulic engineering, twisting like hidden veins beneath the surface. delivering life-giving water to places where rivers dared not flow. Picture this, a vertical shaft plunging into the earth, not to mine gold or gems, but to tap into underground aquifers. From there, a gently sloping tunnel stretched for miles, sometimes dozens of miles, carrying water through the darkness until it emerged in a sunlit courtyard or a bustling marketplace. The genius wasn't just in the digging, it was in the precision. A Canat slope had to be perfect, too steep, and the water would erode the tunnel, too shallow, and it would stagnate. And yet, without compasses or levels, ancient engineers calculated these gradients by eye, passing their knowledge down through generations like a sacred trust. What made Canats revolutionary wasn't just their function, it was their democracy. Unlike grand aqueducts that served imperial cities, Canats were community projects. Villagers pooled labor to dig them, shared their water equally, and maintained them collectively. A single Canat could sustain an entire oasis, turning barren land into orchards heavy with pomegranates and dates. And because the water traveled underground, it didn't evaporate under the desert sun. While surface canals lost half their volume to the heat, Canats delivered nearly every drop to its destination. That efficiency didn't just quench thirst, it fueled empires. Persian kings built their palaces in the middle of deserts, not despite the lack of water, but because Canats made it possible. But here's the twist, Canats weren't just Persian. The technology spread like whispers along trade routes from Oman to Morocco, even reaching as far as China's Turpan Basin. In the hands of the Nabateans, who carved Petra from cliffs, Canats became tools of urban grandeur, feeding elaborate fountain systems that dazzled visitors. The Romans, masters of aqueducts, adopted Canat techniques in North Africa, where their engineers marveled at how these tunnels resisted sabotage. Unlike exposed canals, you couldn't poison or divert a Canat without knowing exactly where to dig. The real secret, though, wasn't the engineering, it was the social contract. Canats required cooperation, not conquest. To maintain them, communities had to resolve disputes peacefully, allocating water shares with meticulous fairness. Some of the earliest legal codes in Mesopotamia included Canat rights, proving that water law was the foundation of civilization itself. And when invaders came, whether Alexander's armies or Arab caliphs, they quickly learned that destroying Canats meant destroying the wealth of the land they hoped to rule. So they preserved them, even expanded them, because these tunnels were more vital than any fortress. Today, thousands of Canats still function, a testament to their timeless design. In Iran, UNESCO listed Canats like the two 500-year-old Gonabad systems still irrigate fields, their builders' names long forgotten but their legacy flowing on. Modern engineers study them for insights into sustainable water management, realizing that these ancient networks might hold answers to today's droughts. Because the lesson of the Canat isn't just about survival, it's about humility. In an age of concrete megadoms and pumped aquifers, these silent tunnels remind us that sometimes the most powerful solutions aren't forced upon nature, but whispered into its depths. Before coins, trade was a messy puzzle of barter, sheep for wheat, pottery for salt, with endless haggling over what anything was truly worth. Then came the Lydians of modern-day Turkey, who around 600 CE did something revolutionary. They stamped lumps of electrum, a natural gold-silver alloy with official marks. These weren't just pretty tokens, they were the world's first standardized currency, bearing the seal of King Alexander to guarantee their weight and purity. Suddenly, a merchant from Ephesus could sell olive oil in Sardis without hauling around livestock or jugs of grain. The value was in the palm of your hand, recognized across the kingdom. But the real power of coins wasn't just convenience, it was control. When Rome minted the denarius, it wasn't merely creating money. it was weaving provinces into an economic web. A soldier stationed in Britannia could be paid in coins that held the same value back in Rome, binding his loyalty to an empire thousands of miles away. Mints became the pulse points of imperial power, strategically placed in cities like Lugdunum, modern Lyon, to flood new territories with currency that bore the emperor's face. Every transaction was a silent reminder of who ruled. Counterfeiters learned the hard way how seriously empires took this system. In China, the Han Dynasty punished fake coin makers with execution by boiling. Rome branded forgers' foreheads before sentencing them to forced labor in mines, a grim irony, since they'd tried to cheat the very system that extracted precious metals from those same pits. The message was clear: money wasn't just metal, it was the lifeblood of the state. Yet coins also became unexpected ambassadors of culture. Athenian owls stamped with the goddess Athena's emblem circulated as far as India, spreading Greek art and ideals alongside trade. The Kushan Empire's gold dinars, minted with bilingual inscriptions, bridged Persian and Sanskrit-speaking worlds. Even today, archaeologists can trace the rise and fall of empires by where their coins appear and disappear in the soil. The most fascinating twist: how these ancient systems foreshadowed modern finance. Rome's inflation crisis, caused by emperors debasing silver coins with cheap metals, mirrors today's debates over currency stability. Lydia's innovation, trust in a piece of stamped metal, laid the groundwork for everything from banknotes to Bitcoin, because the real value of money was never in the gold or silver. It was in the collective belief that a tiny disk could hold the weight of an empire's promise. The great library of Alexandria burned bright, but not alone. It was the crown jewel in a constellation of knowledge hubs that lit up the ancient world. Picture scholars from Athens to Punjab exchanging ideas not through random chance, but through an intentional web of learning. Ships docking at Alexandria's harbor carried more than spices and silk. Their cargo holds hid scrolls from the farthest reaches of the known world. Babylonian star charts nestled beside Indian medical treatises, while Greek geometry texts rubbed shoulders with Persian engineering manuals. This wasn't just storage, it was the first true attempt at a global intellectual marketplace. What set Alexandria apart wasn't just its collection, but its method. The Ptolemies didn't wait for knowledge to come to them, they sent agents to hunt it down. Royal decrees demanded every ship entering the city surrender its books for copying. Originals often stayed in the library's halls, while duplicates sailed back to their owners. Imagine the scene: Egyptian scribes working in shifts to transcribe a rare Sanskrit text on surgery, while upstairs, a debate raged between a Carthaginian astronomer and a Jewish philosopher about the shape of the earth. The library wasn't just preserving ideas, it was smashing them together to spark new ones, and the translations, teams of scholars worked around the clock to render foreign texts into Greek, creating a common language of learning. The famous 72 Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek didn't work in isolation. They were part of a vast, state-sponsored machine of knowledge exchange. This systematic approach turned Alexandria into a linguistic crossroads where a doctor from India could read Hippocrates, and a Greek engineer could study Mesopotamian irrigation techniques. The library's catalogue alone, the Pinax, was a marvel, a 120-volume index of every scroll, organized by subject and author, the ancient equivalent of a search engine. Yet the real tragedy of Alexandria's destruction isn't just the lost scrolls, it's the severed connections. When the library faded, entire lineages of thought vanished from the conversation. Aristarchus of Samos had proposed a heliocentric solar system centuries before Copernicus, but his work survived only in fragments quoted by critics. The medical discoveries of Herophilus, who mapped the nervous system by dissecting cadavers, might have advanced medicine by millennia if his writings hadn't turned to ash. Even the library's physical layout was a loss. Its lecture halls, gardens, and observatories were designed to foster collaboration, a blueprint for modern universities that wouldn't reappear for over 1,000 years. But here's what's often overlooked. Alexandria's flame didn't die completely. Scattered scholars carried fragments of its knowledge to Baghdad, Constantinople, and eventually medieval Europe. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, with its own army of translators, echoed Alexandria's model, preserving Greek texts by rendering them into Arabic. Byzantine monks smuggled precious manuscripts to mountain monasteries, hiding them from iconoclasts. The library's true legacy wasn't just what it held, but what it proved. That progress thrives when ideas circulate freely across borders, languages, and cultures. Centuries later, when Renaissance thinkers rediscovered these ancient texts, they weren't just reading words, they were reconnecting a circuit broken for ages. The printing press, the scientific method, even the internet all follow Alexandria's fundamental insight. Knowledge grows when shared and withers when hoarded. The library's physical walls may have crumbled, but its spirit, that restless, relentless exchange of ideas, still flickers in every research lab, digital archive, and classroom today. Because the great irony is this: though fire consumed Alexandria's scrolls, it couldn't extinguish the revolutionary idea they represented, that no single civilization holds all the answers, but together they might come close. When Pharaoh Thutmose I married his daughter Hatshepsut to her half-brother, it wasn't just a family affair, it was geopolitical chess. This wasn't about romance, it was about securing the throne of Egypt against rival claimants and binding the kingdom's factions together with bloodlines stronger than any treaty. Across the ancient world, royal marriages functioned like invisible threads stitching empires together. A princess sent to a foreign court wasn't just a bride, she was a living peace treaty, a human guarantee of alliance, and often a highly placed informant. Take the marriage of Cleopatra VII to Julius Caesar. While poets might frame it as a passionate affair, the reality was far more calculated. By aligning with Rome's most powerful general, Cleopatra didn't just protect Egypt from becoming a province. She positioned her son as heir to both civilizations. And when she later wed Mark Antony, it wasn't just personal, it was a deliberate move to counter Octavian's growing power. These unions were less about hearts and more about highways securing grain shipments from Alexandria, safeguarding trade routes through the Levant, and ensuring Egyptian gold kept flowing into Roman coffers. Europe's Habsburgs took this strategy to dizzying extremes. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," wasn't just clever wordplay, it was their empire's blueprint. By the 16th century, Habsburg marriages had woven a web so vast it stretched from Spain to Hungary, Mexico to the Philippines. When Maria Theresa of Austria married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, she wasn't just gaining a husband, she was absorbing a buffer state between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Their daughter Marie Antoinette's marriage to Louis XVI of France, that was supposed to neutralize centuries of Franco-Austrian rivalry. Of course, history had other plans. But the most fascinating marriages were often the quietest. In imperial China, the Han dynasty routinely sent princesses to nomadic Xiongnu chieftains, not as surrenders but as Trojan horses. These women carried more than silks, they brought Han customs, subtly reshaping the tastes of their new families. Over time, steppe leaders who once demanded tribute started requesting Chinese tutors instead. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Fujiwara clan didn't conquer the throne, they married into it, placing their daughters as empresses generation after generation until the emperor's advisors were all in-laws. The genius of these arrangements lay in their flexibility. A royal wedding could avert a war without firing a single arrow. When Byzantium's Emperor Justinian married Theodora, a former actress, it wasn't just scandalous, it was strategic. Theodora's connections to Constantinople's merchant class gave Justinian eyes and ears in the city's volatile streets. And when the Khmer Empire wed its princes to neighboring Cham princesses, they weren't just celebrating, they were converting rivals into relatives, turning contested borders into shared farmlands. Yet these alliances had a dark edge. The infamous bloody wedding of St. Bartholomew's Day, where a French royal marriage devolved into a massacre of Huguenots, proved that kinship could fracture as easily as it bonded. And the Habsburgs' obsession with keeping power in the family led to generations of genetic disasters, from cleft palates to madness. The very thing meant to strengthen dynasties sometimes sowed their ruin. What's astonishing is how these ancient strategies echo today. Modern diplomacy still leans on symbolic marriages. Think of corporate mergers framed as perfect unions, or political dynasties intermarrying to consolidate influence. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Power doesn't always move through armies or laws. Sometimes it moves through whispered vows and carefully chosen wedding guests. Behind every tiara and crown lay not just a monarch, but a masterstroke of realpolitik, written not in ink but in lineage. Wherever empires drew borders and levied taxes, shadow networks bloomed like stubborn wildflowers through cracks in stone. Take the Chinese silk monopoly, guarded so fiercely that exporting silkworms carried a death penalty. Yet by 600 CE, Byzantine monks were smuggling cocoons in hollowed-out walking sticks, breaking China's stranglehold on the luxury trade. This wasn't just theft, it was economic warfare waged with audacity. The monks' success reshaped Mediterranean power dynamics, fueling Constantinople's rise as a silk producer and proving that no law could outpace human cunning. Arabian frankincense routes tell an even richer tale. Roman emperors taxed this sacred resin at staggering rates, desperate to profit from its use in temples and funerals. But Nabatean traders, nomads who knew every desert wadi, built underground storage caves along alternate paths, bypassing imperial toll stations entirely. Their hidden warehouses, carved beneath the sands, held fortunes worth more than gold. When Rome finally crushed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 CE, they didn't just conquer a people, they co-opted their smuggling infrastructure, turning rebel hideouts into state-sanctioned depots. The most fascinating part, how these networks mirrored and mocked official trade systems. Persian customs agents kept meticulous records of camel caravans crossing their borders, unaware that the same caravans often carried secret compartments. A load of dates might conceal Greek wine banned under Zoroastrian purity laws, while bundles of cotton hid tin ingots destined for enemy bronze smiths. Even the mighty Sasanian Empire, with its army of tax collectors, couldn't stop the flow. But perhaps no story captures the smugglers' audacity better than the Malabar pepper wars. For centuries, Arab middlemen controlled Europe's spice supply, spinning wild tales about pepper groves guarded by dragons to justify exorbitant prices. Then in the 1500s, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama smashed the monopoly by sailing directly to India only for local merchants to outflank him. Kerala's fishermen began running nighttime canoe missions past Portuguese patrols, delivering pepper to rival Ottoman and Venetian ships waiting beyond the horizon. The lesson was clear: empires could build navies, but they couldn't control the tide. These underground routes did more than move goods, they moved ideas. Banned religious texts traveled in spice barrels, heretical philosophies hid in pottery shipments, and rebel leaders disguised themselves as merchants. When authorities in Ming China banned private ocean trade, coastal communities simply went dark, building illegal ports where officials dared not tread. Their defiance birthed entire pirate cities like Shuangyu, where Japanese swordsmiths bartered with Portuguese gunsmiths under makeshift flags. What emperories dismissed as lawlessness was often just commerce in disguise, proof that demand always outpaces decrees. The very existence of these shadow networks revealed a truth that still resonates. Control is an illusion. For every tax collector counting coins, there's a trader counting stars, navigating by their light toward freedom's next horizon. The sword wasn't the only weapon empires wielded. Language cut deeper and lasted longer. When Rome's legions marched into Gaul or Iberia, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought scribes. Latin wasn't merely a tongue, it was a blueprint for loyalty. Tax records, legal decrees, even graffiti on Pompeii's walls, all etched in the conqueror's script. To speak Latin was to access power, to plead your case in court, or secure a trade contract. But this wasn't voluntary assimilation, it was calculated erasure. Local dialects like Etruscan or Gaulish withered under the weight of imperial grammar, their poetry and laws fading into silence. Yet language was never a one-way street. On the edges of empires, something fascinating bubbled up: creoles. In Byzantine markets, traders blended Greek with Arabic slang, creating a pidgin that let silk merchants haggle without sharing a mother tongue. Along the Nile, Coptic scribes kept their ancient Egyptian alive in secret, weaving it into Christian hymns under Roman noses. These linguistic hybrids weren't just practical, they were acts of quiet rebellion, proof that even the mightiest empire couldn't fully control how people thought. Nowhere was this dance more intricate than in the Buddhist world. When Ashoka the Great plastered his edicts across India, he didn't use Sanskrit, the language of priests. He used Prakrit, the speech of the streets. It was a masterstroke. By speaking to the masses in their own vernacular, his moral laws felt personal, not imposed. Centuries later, Buddhist monks would repeat the trick, translating scriptures into Tibetan, Chinese, even Cantonese. Each translation wasn't just a conversion of words, it was a conquest of hearts, proving that faith traveled best when it spoke locally. But the real power brokers, the translators. In medieval Toledo, teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, rendering Arabic astronomy texts into Latin for European universities. Their work didn't just transfer knowledge, it ignited the Renaissance. Meanwhile, in the Mongol court, polyglot administrators like Rashid al-Din orchestrated an empire where Persian, Turkish, and Chinese flowed freely. To control the flow of words was to control the flow of gold, of armies, of history itself. The irony, of course, is that lingua francas often outlived the empires that spawned them. Long after Rome fell, Latin thrived in monasteries and laboratories. Sanskrit, weaponized by Hindu kings, became the soul of Southeast Asian art. Even today, when a Spanish tourist orders coffee in Tagalog-accented English, they're tapping into an ancient truth. Language isn't just about meaning, it's about who gets to be heard. And in that struggle, every accent, every borrowed word, every stubbornly preserved dialect is a victory against silence. Courier pigeons might seem like relics from a bygone era, but in their day, they were the fastest information technology on Earth. The Romans didn't just use these birds, they perfected their deployment, maintaining dovecotes near military outposts and training pigeons to fly hundreds of miles with tiny scrolls strapped to their legs. Picture a general besieged in a distant fortress, his couriers cut off by enemy troops. With a single released pigeon, he could summon reinforcements or warn the capital of betrayal, all while his adversaries stood helpless below, watching the bird vanish into the sky. The birds weren't just messengers, they were feathered lifelines capable of speeds over 50 miles per hour, outpacing even the swiftest horsemen. But pigeons had competition in the ancient race for speed, signal fires. The Great Wall of China wasn't just a physical barrier, it was an early warning system stretching thousands of miles, with towers spaced precisely within sight of one another. At the first sign of Mongol movement, guards would light a blaze, triggering a chain reaction of flames that could cross the empire faster than any rider. The Han Dynasty even developed coded fire signals, different numbers of flames or intervals between them conveying specific details about enemy numbers or direction. This wasn't just about shouting danger, it was about transmitting data with precision, turning fire into a language. What's astonishing is how reliable these systems were. In Byzantium, Emperor Nicephorus II used pigeon posts to coordinate attacks on Arab strongholds, with birds returning to lofts mounted on ships that moved with his campaigns. The Mongols, masters of adaptation, adopted China's fire beacon system but added mirror flashes during daylight, creating a 24-hour alert network. Even in medieval Europe, where castles perched on craggy hills, smoke columns could rally allies across entire regions before an invading army finished crossing a river. Yet the real genius lay in their simplicity. Unlike fragile roads or corruptible human messengers, fire and feathers required no infrastructure beyond what nature provided. Storms might ground pigeons, but they couldn't intercept them. Fog might obscure smoke signals, but it couldn't forge them. And while empires rose and fell, these methods endured. Napoleon used pigeons centuries after the Romans, and lighthouses still operate on the same principle as those Han Dynasty beacons. The lesson: sometimes the most effective solutions aren't the most complicated. In an age of satellites and fiber optics, it's easy to forget that urgency once had wings, or that a flickering flame on a distant hilltop could mean the difference between survival and ruin. These ancient networks remind us that innovation isn't always about inventing something new, it's about mastering what already exists, then pushing it to its limits. Nomadic trade fairs transformed barren stretches of desert and steppe into dazzling, temporary capitals of commerce and diplomacy. Picture the legendary salt markets of the Sahara, where Tuareg traders arrived after months of crossing dunes, their camels laden with slabs of precious salt from mines like Taoudeni. Meanwhile, merchants from Timbuktu bartered gold dust and kola nuts, while Arab traders unloaded bolts of silk that had traveled farther than most humans ever would. These weren't just markets, they were pop-up metropolises, complete with makeshift courts to settle disputes, healers treating ailments from dysentery to scorpion stings, and poets reciting epics under the stars. For a few weeks each year, the middle of nowhere became the center of everything. What made these fairs revolutionary was their ability to connect worlds that otherwise might never meet. Take the Dombay Fair in the Caucasus, where Georgian wine flowed into the cups of Mongol horsemen, while Armenian merchants negotiated with Venetian buyers over piles of Caspian caviar. No single empire controlled these gatherings, yet all benefited. The Golden Horde provided security, knowing the taxes collected would fill their coffers. Italian city-states sent agents to secure contracts for exotic goods, bypassing the Byzantine middlemen who usually dominated Mediterranean trade. Even entertainers thrived. Acrobats from India might perform alongside Slavic minstrels, their acts blending into something entirely new by the fair's end. The real magic lay in their impermanence. Unlike stone and mortar cities, these fairs left no ruins behind, just whispers in travelers' accounts and fragments of pottery scattered across the sands. Yet their impact was profound. The Volga Bulgars used their annual fair to introduce Islam to Scandinavian traders, some of whom carried the faith back to Viking settlements. Along the Silk Road's northern branch, the Eichher Fair at Turfen became a laboratory for religious exchange, where Nestorian Christian hymns mingled with Buddhist sutras and Manichaean prayers. For empires, these events offered a low-risk way to project soft power. No need to conquer territory, just send your most persuasive merchants with the finest goods and let desire do the rest. But the fairs weren't just about goods and gods, they were early hubs of intellectual property theft. At the Novgorod Fair, Russian craftsmen studied Arab astrolabes, then crafted their own versions by winter's end. Saharan salt traders guarded their routes fiercely, but young apprentices still memorized landmarks and techniques, carrying secrets to new generations. The most valuable commodity wasn't salt or silk, it was knowledge exchanged as freely as coins in the right hands. When the last camel packed up and the final deal was struck, the fairgrounds returned to silence. Yet the connections made their rippled outward for years. A Song dynasty porcelain shard found in Morocco, a Samarkandi melody woven into a Spanish folk song, these were the fair's true legacy. Not the temporary city of tents, but the permanent changes it left in the minds and cultures of those who passed through. In a world before instant communication, these gatherings proved something timeless. Commerce isn't just about what's bought and sold. It's about who meets, what they learn, and how the world shifts when they do. Beneath the towering pyramids and grand temples of ancient Egypt, a different kind of power thrived, one that didn't rely on armies or crowns but on secrets. The priesthoods of Ammon weren't just spiritual leaders, they were the keepers of astronomy, medicine, and architecture, their knowledge so vital that pharaohs dared not rule without their blessing. When a king needed to align a temple with the stars or cure a royal fever, he didn't consult a scroll, he summoned a priest. These weren't mere servants of the gods, they were the original power brokers, wielding influence that could make or break dynasties. Half a world away, in the smoky forges of medieval Europe, another kind of secret society held sway, the guilds. To outsiders, they might have looked like simple unions of blacksmiths or masons, but their inner workings were anything but ordinary. Becoming a master craftsman wasn't just about skill, it was about surviving years of initiation, swearing blood oaths, and learning techniques guarded more fiercely than castle vaults. The stained glass artists of Chartres or the sword smiths of Damascus didn't just make things, they held monopolies on knowledge that shaped empires. A king might command an army, but without the guilds, he couldn't arm it or build its fortresses. What made these groups so formidable wasn't just their expertise, it was their exclusivity. In an age before patents, the only way to protect a trade secret was silence. The Venetian glassmakers of Murano, for instance, weren't allowed to leave the island under penalty of death, lest they reveal the secrets of Cristallo, the flawless glass that made their city rich. Similarly, the Hashishin of Persia combined political assassination with an almost supernatural aura of secrecy, their very name becoming synonymous with covert power. Yet the true genius of these societies lay in their adaptability. When the Roman Empire crumbled, it was the monastic orders, the Benedictines, the Cistercians, that preserved not just religion but agriculture, medicine, and law. Their scriptoria became the backup drives of civilization, copying texts while warlords burned originals. Even in China, the eunuch bureaucrats of the Han dynasty turned their closed ranks into a shadow government, controlling emperors through their mastery of paperwork and palace protocols. The irony, many of these groups claimed to serve higher ideals, God, art, the state, but their real currency was access. A medieval alchemist might promise to turn lead into gold for a king, but his true value lay in the chemical processes he guarded, which could purify metals or create explosives. The Knights Templar, ostensibly protectors of pilgrims, became the medieval equivalent of a multinational bank, their network of fortresses and letters of credit stretching from London to Jerusalem. And let's not forget the unintended consequences. When guilds grew too powerful, they could strangle innovation, like when the Worshipful Company of Pewterers in London banned new alloys to protect their monopoly. But they could also seed revolutions. The Freemasons, descended from stoneworkers' guilds, would later become a breeding ground for Enlightenment ideas that toppled monarchies. The lesson here is timeless. Knowledge, when hoarded and controlled, becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. These societies remind us that the real movers of history aren't always the faces on coins or the names in chronicles. Sometimes they're the ones whispering in the shadows, holding secrets too valuable to share. And in that, they were the original influencers, shaping the world not by force, but by knowing what others did not. When the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent demanded the sons of Hungarian nobles as hostages, he wasn't just securing obedience, he was playing a psychological chess game. These young men lived in gilded cages within Topkapi Palace, trained in Ottoman arts, fluent in Turkish, and dressed in silk. But beneath the luxury lay an unspoken threat. One wrong move by their fathers, and their heads would adorn the palace gates. Yet this system wasn't pure cruelty, it was a perverse kind of statecraft. By raising these hostages as quasi-family, the Ottomans turned them into living contracts, human embodiments of trust forged through fear. Rome perfected this dark art centuries earlier. Conquered kings like Jugurtha of Numidia or Vercingetorix of Gaul weren't just imprisoned. They were paraded through the Forum before being strangled in the Tullianum dungeon. But their children, they were educated as Romans, given estates, even married into senatorial families. The message was clear. Rebellion meant annihilation, but compliance offered assimilation. Some hostages, like the Germanic prince Arminius, used this privilege to learn Roman tactics before turning them against their captors in the Teutoburg forest massacre. The system could backfire spectacularly, yet hostage exchanges also birthed unexpected cultural bridges. When Byzantine Emperor Constantine V sent his daughter to marry the Bulgar Khan Telerig, she didn't just bring dowry gifts, she introduced Byzantine court rituals that transformed Bulgar governance. The Japanese shoguns did the same with daimyo heirs, turning Edo into a forced finishing school where warlords' sons absorbed imperial customs. These hostages became accidental diplomats, smuggling home everything from architectural styles to culinary tastes. A Venetian merchant held in Mamluk Cairo might return with recipes for sugarcane syrup that would later sweeten Renaissance banquets. The Mongols took this further, treating hostages as intelligence assets. Sons of conquered rulers were raised alongside Genghis Khan's own children, learning Mongol strategies only to be sent back as puppet leaders. Some, like the Jin prince Wanyan Yongji, became more loyal to their captors than their birth families, a Stockholm syndrome on an imperial scale. But the real twist came when these exchanges created hybrid cultures. The Norman kingdom of Sicily flourished precisely because Arab, Greek, and Lombard hostages intermingled in its polyglot courts, blending traditions into something entirely new. What's chilling is how modern this ancient practice feels. During the Cold War, defectors' families often faced retaliation, a grim echo of hostage diplomacy. Even today, when corporations demand executives' children attend elite schools near headquarters, or when cultural exchange students become informal ambassadors, we're seeing faint shadows of this old system. The chains might be invisible now, but the calculus remains the same. Trust is easier to enforce when it wears a human face. Hadrian's Wall, that great stone scar across Britain's northern frontier, wasn't just a barrier, it was a bustling crossroads where the Roman Empire's power met its limits. Picture this, legionaries from Spain and Syria patrolling the ramparts, while just beyond the gates, Celtic traders haggled over amber from the Baltic and wine from Gaul. The wall wasn't meant to seal the empire off. It was a filter, controlling the flow of people and goods while creating a strange, vibrant world in between. Soldiers stationed there didn't just fight, they married locals, adopted Celtic gods, and even traded their armor for furs when supplies ran low. The frontier wasn't the end of Rome, it was where Rome became something new. These border zones were laboratories of innovation. When the Han dynasty built watchtowers along the Silk Road, they weren't just spotting raiders, they were absorbing new technologies from the steppe nomads they fought. Chinese crossbows gained range and power after encountering Central Asian recurve bows, while Roman engineers borrowed ballista designs from Parthian desert outposts. Even the Vikings, those infamous raiders, first encountered Arabic silver coins in frontier markets like Shadowy, sparking a trade network that stretched from Baghdad to Dublin. The edges of empire were where ideas collided, mutated, and spread. But the real magic happened in the markets that sprouted like weeds around military forts. Take Dura Europos on the Euphrates, a Roman garrison town where Greek soldiers bartered with Persian silk merchants under the watchful eyes of Pomeran archers. The garbage pits there tell a startling story. Indian pepper mixed with Gallic pottery, Chinese lacquer fragments beside local wheat grains. This wasn't just trade, it was cultural alchemy. A Roman centurion might develop a taste for Sogdian melons, while a Germanic mercenary carried home Mediterranean olive oil as a souvenir. Empires drew lines in the sand, but people kept crossing them. The most fascinating part, how these spaces defied simple labels. The Great Wall of China, often imagined as impregnable, actually had regulated gates where Mongol tribes came to trade horses for grain, a carefully managed exchange that kept peace for decades. Similarly, the Moorish forts along Spain's Marca Hispanica weren't just military posts. They were translation hubs where Christian and Muslim scholars worked side by side, preserving ancient texts that would later fuel Europe's Renaissance. Frontiers weren't just battle lines, they were negotiation tables, yet these liminal worlds couldn't last forever. When empires weakened, the borderlands were the first to fray. The limes of Germania, once studded with thriving garrison towns, dissolved into ghostly ruins as Rome's grip slipped. But something unexpected survived, the hybrid cultures born in these contact zones. The Swahili coast, shaped by Arab and African traders meeting at fort ports like Kilwa, still speaks a language infused with both Bantu and Arabic roots. The legacy of these spaces wasn't in the stones left behind, but in the invisible threads they wove between worlds. That's the paradox of frontiers. They were both the most vulnerable and most creative parts of any empire. A wall might mark where a civilization ended, but the ground beneath it became where new civilizations began. Because when soldiers put down roots, when traders shared stories, when enemies became neighbors, that's when the real empire building happened. Not through conquest, but through connection. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer cities, he conquered minds. When he ordered his portrait stamped onto coins with the horns of Ammon, he wasn't just minting currency, he was minting a legend. Those curled ram horns weren't decorative. They were divine branding, a visual cue linking him to the Egyptian god Zeus Ammon. It was ancient propaganda, a masterclass in perception management. His subjects might never see him in person, but every time they traded a drachma, they held proof of his godhood in their palms, and it worked. By the time he reached India, local rulers hesitated to fight someone rumored to be immortal. Rome took this theater of control to brutal new heights. Emperors like Septimius Severus didn't just defeat rivals, he erased them. Statues of his fallen enemy, Pescennius Niger, were toppled, his name chiseled off monuments, even his existence scrubbed from official records. This wasn't just revenge, it was memory warfare. Without images or inscriptions, dissenters vanished from public consciousness, their rebellions reduced to whispers. The practice even had a name, damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. One decree, and a man's legacy could dissolve like salt in water, but the most insidious propaganda often wore a friendlier face. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, commissioned poets like Virgil to spin the myth of a golden age under his rule. The Aeneid wasn't just epic poetry, it was political PR, tracing Augustus' lineage back to the Trojan hero Aeneas. Meanwhile, his engineers built altars engraved with peace and prosperity slogans while his armies crushed rebellions in the provinces. The message was clear: resistance was futile, but loyalty brought bread and circuses. Persia's kings played a subtler game. Royal inscriptions at Behistun and Persepolis didn't just celebrate victories, they scripted reality. Darius the Great's famous cliff carvings showed rebellious leaders groveling at his feet, each labeled liar in cuneiform. But here's the twist: archaeologists found evidence some rebels were actually allies, their defiance invented to justify conquest. It was fake news carved in stone, a permanent record of alternative facts. Even whispers could topple thrones. Byzantine emperors employed secreties, spies who spread rumors in Constantinople's bathhouses and markets. A well-placed story about a general's disloyalty or a plague sent by angry saints could shift public opinion overnight. When Emperor Justinian faced the Nika riots, he didn't just send soldiers, he sent actors disguised as protesters to spread discord, turning the mob against itself. The lesson echoes through time. Power doesn't just reside in armies or treasuries, it lives in the stories people believe. Whether stamped on coins, etched in stone, or hissed in alleyways, these narratives shaped empires as surely as any sword. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all: the pen and the chisel and the rumor have always been mightier than the blade. The same roads that carried Roman legions to glory also carried their doom. In 165 CE, soldiers returning from Mesopotamia brought back more than spoils. They carried a deadly stowaway, likely smallpox. The Antonine Plague didn't just kill millions, it exposed the empire's Achilles heel. Those flawless stone highways, the pride of Roman engineering, became superhighways for disease. Within months, the illness leaped from army camps to bustling ports, from Gaul's vineyards to Egypt's granaries. Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself succumbed, his deathbed writings eerily silent about the carnage outside his palace walls. The empire's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, had become its fatal weakness. Centuries later, the Mongols faced a similar reckoning. Their Yam system, the envy of the medieval world, could move silk and spices across continents in weeks. But in 1347, it delivered something far darker: bubonic plague. Infected fleas hitched rides in grain sacks and fur bales, racing from Crimean ports to Chinese cities with terrifying efficiency. By the time the Black Death reached Europe, it had already hollowed out the steppes' nomadic clans, the very people who'd built history's most efficient trade network. Kublai Khan's descendants watched helplessly as their carefully maintained way stations became mass graves, their couriers now carriers of catastrophe. What's chilling is how these ancient tragedies mirror modern vulnerabilities. The Silk Road's caravanserais functioned like medieval airports, hubs where pathogens could jump between hosts just as viruses do in today's transit lounges. When Constantinople fell to plague in 542, Byzantine doctors noted how the disease followed shipping lanes, slaughtering dockworkers before moving inland, a pattern eerily similar to 21st century pandemic models. Even the solutions tried then feel uncomfortably familiar. Venetian health boards imposing 40-day quarantines, the original 40 giorni, or Mongol Khans ordering burning of contaminated goods. Yet amidst the devastation, these collapses also reveal resilience. After the Antonine Plague, Rome rebuilt its legions with Germanic recruits, inadvertently sowing seeds for future cultural blending. Post-Black Death labor shortages empowered European peasants to demand better wages, shaking feudalism's foundations. The networks that spread death also carried survival strategies, Chinese quarantine methods reaching Arabia via medical texts, or Italian city-states adopting Mongol sanitation practices. The lesson written in these ruins isn't that connectivity is dangerous, it's that fragility is the price of interdependence. Today's supply chains and data networks face the same paradox. The more efficient they become, the faster crisis can travel. Ancient empires teach us that the answer isn't retreating behind walls, but building smarter buffers, because the alternative, isolation, was never truly an option. The Mongols could have shut down the Yam, just as Rome could have abandoned its roads, but they didn't, because even knowing the risks, they understood something timeless. A network's greatest threat isn't the plague it might carry, but the prosperity it stops carrying forever. Women in the shadows of history didn't just navigate empires, they quietly held them together. Take Lydia of Thyatira, the merchant mentioned in ancient texts not as a footnote, but as a powerhouse. In a world where women were often barred from official trade guilds, she built a thriving purple dye business, dealing directly with Roman elites and temple officials. That purple wasn't just a color, it was a status symbol, and Lydia controlled its flow. Her story reveals a truth empires rarely advertised. The most vital networks often ran through back channels, where women brokered deals over loom work and temple offerings rather than in marble forums. Then there's the case of Delilah, often reduced to a biblical villainess. Look closer, and she emerges as a master of psychological warfare. The Philistines didn't send soldiers to capture Samson. They sent a woman who understood intimacy could be a weapon. By exploiting personal trust, she accessed intelligence no spy could gather through force. This wasn't treachery, it was strategy. Across the ancient Near East, women like her operated in the blurred space between loyalty and survival, using their perceived invisibility to sway outcomes. Religious orders offered another covert path to influence. Vestal virgins in Rome wielded authority unimaginable for other women. They drafted wills, negotiated pardons, and even safeguarded state documents. Their chastity wasn't just piety, it was a political shield, ensuring they couldn't be pressured by marital alliances. When the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BCE, it was the Vestals who smuggled sacred relics to safety, preserving the spiritual backbone of the state. Their power didn't come from a throne, but from being untouchable intermediaries between mortals and gods. Salons and royal courts were equally potent stages. The Tang dynasty's courtesans in Chang'an weren't mere entertainers. They were diplomats who composed poetry that could make or break reputations. A well-placed verse mocking a general's arrogance or praising a minister's wisdom could shift imperial favor overnight. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, Empress Theodora's early career as an actress gave her street-smart connections that Justinian later relied on to quell riots. Her network of theater friends and silk workers became the empire's early warning system. Even kinship ties masked extraordinary leverage. Mongol women like Sorgatoni Beki, mother of Kublai Khan, managed entire appanages territories granted to noble families, while men waged war. She funded Buddhist monasteries not just for piety, but to cultivate allies among clergy who could vouch for her family's legitimacy. Her letters to Persian administrators, recently deciphered, reveal meticulous oversight of trade routes and tax collection. Nomadic custom barred her from leading armies, but her control of resources meant no Khan could rule without her support. The irony: these women's invisibility in official records often amplified their real-world impact. When archaeologists unearthed the Viking settlement at Birka, they assumed a lavish grave filled with swords and horses belonged to a warrior until DNA testing revealed it was a woman. Her burial goods suggest she wasn't just a fighter but a strategist, possibly coordinating raids and negotiations. History called her anonymous, science proved her indispensable. What binds these stories isn't just gender, it's methodology. Where men wielded swords and laws, women mastered social fabrics, gossip as intelligence, gifts as contracts, kinship as diplomacy. Their networks were flexible, resilient, and often underestimated until it was too late to counter them. Because power isn't always about who holds the crown, sometimes it's about who holds the threads. The fingerprints of ancient networks are everywhere if you know where to look, not as crumbling ruins, but as living blueprints beneath our modern world. Take the United States interstate highway system, often hailed as Eisenhower's masterpiece. Its design was directly inspired by the German Autobahn, but the Germans themselves had studied Napoleon's roads, which were modeled after, you guessed it, Roman highways. Those straight, durable roads built 2,000 years ago to move legions now carry 18-wheelers and minivans. Even the numbering system echoes imperial logic. Odd-numbered interstates run north-south like the ancient Via Appia, while evens stretch east-west like the Silk Road's caravan trails. The past didn't just influence the present, it laid the pavement. Then there's the internet, celebrated as the ultimate modern invention, yet its structure mirrors the Silk Road in uncanny ways. Both rely on decentralized nodes, caravanserais then, server farms now where information or silk changes hands. Packet switching, the method that lets data find the fastest route, operates like a Mongol messenger swapping horses at way stations. Even cyber attacks follow ancient patterns. Byzantine spies poisoning wells to starve cities now have digital counterparts in hackers targeting water plants. The more we innovate, the more we reinvent old solutions to timeless problems. Consider how borders cling to ancient paths. The Autobahn curves around medieval trade routes. The US-Mexico border follows old Spanish colonial trails, which themselves traced indigenous trading paths. In China, high-speed rail lines shadow the Tang dynasty's postal roads, connecting cities that grew wealthy a millennium ago for the same reasons they thrive today: location, location, location. Geography hasn't changed, and neither has human ingenuity for exploiting it. Even mundane systems carry ancient DNA. The phrase postal service comes from the Roman posta, meaning station, but the concept is pure Persian royal road. Modern zip codes, a direct descendant of the Inca's Quipu knot system, where cords recorded deliveries to distant storehouses, and those sprawling Amazon warehouses. They're just caravanserais with robots stocking goods along the digital Silk Road of our time. The most profound legacy, though, isn't in concrete or code, it's in mindset. When Roman engineers surveyed roads, they planned for centuries, not decades. Today's fiber optic cables, buried deep with future capacity in mind, follow that same long game. The past whispers a simple truth: connectivity isn't just about moving things. It's about building systems so resilient they outlive empires, carrying not just goods or data, but the stubborn human dream of staying linked across time and space. That's the real inheritance, not the roads, but the roadmap. The secret networks of ancient empires weren't just feats of engineering, they were living, breathing systems that shaped the destiny of civilizations. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of today's internet, power grids, and global supply chains, all rolled into one. The Romans didn't just lay down roads, they built arteries of empire, pumping soldiers, taxes, and ideas to every corner of their world. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they mastered the art of moving information faster than their enemies could react. These weren't static monuments to power. They were dynamic, adaptable lifelines that could bend without breaking, even when empires crumbled around them. What's striking is how these networks mirror our own modern challenges. The Silk Road's caravanserais functioned like medieval data centers, where goods, ideas, and even diseases traveled at speeds unimaginable for the time. Today, we grapple with the same trade-offs: lightning-fast global trade versus the risk of pandemics, seamless communication versus the spread of misinformation. The ancients faced these dilemmas too, and their solutions or failures hold eerie parallels to our own. When the Antonine Plague raced along Roman roads or the Black Death hitchhiked on Mongol trade routes, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning about the double-edged sword of connectivity. Yet these systems also reveal timeless truths about resilience. The Inca's Quipu cords and chasqui runners didn't just survive the Andes' harsh terrain, they thrived because they were built for it. The Persian Canats, hidden beneath deserts, outlasted dynasties because they worked with nature, not against it. There's a lesson here for our fragile digital age. The strongest networks aren't always the most visible. Sometimes survival depends on the quiet, decentralized systems, the ones that don't make it into history books until archaeologists dig them up. As we scroll through social media or track a package crossing continents in real time, we're part of a story that began millennia ago. The same hunger that drove Phoenician merchants to sail beyond the horizon now fuels our quest to connect across oceans and algorithms. But the past whispers a caution. Networks don't just transmit power, they test it. The empires that lasted weren't the ones with the biggest armies, but the ones that kept their lifelines flowing, even when the world turned against them. So the next time you marvel at a highway, a shipping container, or a Wi-Fi signal, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of ancient visionaries who turned the impossible into the inevitable. Their legacy isn't just in the stones they left behind, but in the invisible threads that still bind us together. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: the future belongs to those who learn to weave them wisely. Now it's your turn. Which of these ancient networks fascinates you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed unraveling these hidden histories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. The conversation doesn't end here. It's just another node in the